Yes, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, again, dependent whereabouts you are in the world. And you're very welcome to this presentation. This presentation is entitled A Comparison Between BSEN and American Standards. And this is by myself, Douglas Masterson, GAI Technical Manager. And as well as that, today we have Laura Fry-Weaver, who's DHI Vice President of Education, Certification and Technical Activities. Laura, you are most welcome, and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Okay, we'll go on to the slides. So just a bit of a brief background on the speakers. So we have, as I say, we have Laura here, who's Vice President of Education, Certification and Technical Activities. Laura, although she doesn't look it, has had over 30 years in the door security and safety industry, is a distinguished architectural hardware consultant, certified construction specifier, and an NFPA technical committee member. And Laura will talk a little bit later about what we mean by NFPA. For those of you who don't know me, and probably a lot of you do, I'm GAI Technical Manager since 2014. And again, I don't look it, but I have been over 30 years in the hardware and ironmongery industry too. And those are a few of the committees that I am involved with. SEN and BS standards, as some of you may have heard if you were at the presentation earlier. And also WG12, Working Group 12 for Competence in Construction Products, which I co-chair, and the Construction Leadership Council Brexit Forum. Okay, so the learning aims of this presentation are as follows. We'll take a look at the introduction and background to standards. We'll look at the product standards itself, British, European, and American. We'll have a look at fire testing and the differentials between, again, British and European and American, different types of standards. And we'll do the same thing in relation to accessibility, paying more specific attention to UK and America. We'll then follow it up with some useful information, and then we'll let you get on with your evening, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for the horse racing, although it's virtual, later on. So we're going to start now with an introduction and background, and I'm going to hand over to Laura. Oh, sorry, I'm not. My apologies. England and America are two countries separated by a common language. And that is something that the Irish writer George Bernard Shaw had said. And really, it's the same with standards. We both have sets of standards. They're not identical standards, but they do relate to hardware. They do relate to doors. They do relate to accessibility. And although our standards may be different, the intent is the same, that we have safe products that are safe in use. Okay, Laura.
Thanks. So it'd be hard to talk about standards without understanding a little bit about SDOs, or the development organizations. So SDOs work to formulate all types of standards for all types of products, from the toaster in your kitchen to the commercial wood door that's installed on your job site. Some of the SDOs within the door security and safety industry include BHMA, NFPA, WDMA, NAM, SDI, UL, and on Douglas's side of the pond, there's BSI and SEN. We hear a lot about ANSI when we talk about standards, so let's start with ANSI. ANSI is the American National Standards Institute. They would be the U.S. equivalent to the British Standards Institution. ANSI is not itself a standards development organization, but ANSI provides a framework for fair standard development, and they administer and coordinate the U.S. Voluntary Standards and Conformity Assessment System. They were founded over 100 years ago. Many parties are involved in the standard development process: manufacturers, users, installers, enforcing agencies, consumers, insurance companies, and even special experts. ANSI's approval of a standard means openness and due process were used, and consensus was achieved amongst those who would be affected by the standard. ANSI has approximately 9,500 standards. UL is the largest and oldest testing lab in the U.S. UL is also a SDO with a focus on fire and safety. Their first standard was produced in 1903 for tin-clad fire doors, so they have a long history of product testing and standard development in our industry. UL standards generally involve separate testing from the BHMA performance tests, and they may or may not include an actual fire test on a door. For security purposes, UL has an option that focuses on burglary resistance, similar to the BS 3621 standard in the UK. The UL mark on a product means that UL has tested and evaluated samples of that product and determined that they meet the requirements in the standard they're testing to. The UL mark is similar in stature and status to certifier in the UK. NFPA is a global self-funded nonprofit organization. NFPA is also an SDO. NFPA's mission is to save lives and reduce loss by providing information and knowledge. They do this through their 300 consensus codes and standards. NFP has over 250 technical committees. I sit on 7 of those committees. One of the most widely used NFPA codes is the Life Safety Code NFPA 101. NFPA 101 can be used in conjunction with a building code or alone in jurisdictions that don't have a building code in place. It's used by many federal government agencies, including the Department of Veteran Affairs and the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services in the U.S. It's also used for means of egress requirements in many jurisdictions. NFPA is used for strategies to protect people based on building construction, protection, and occupancy features. The closest equivalent to NFPA 101 in the UK is BS 9999 or BS 9991. You can see on the screen there's a picture of Sparky the fire dog. Sparky is NFPA's mascot. He shows up in a lot of NFPA's public education and outreach, especially for school-age children. And if you get a chance to visit NFPA's offices in Quincy, Massachusetts, you can see this very statue of Sparky. BHMA is the only SDO accredited by ANSI to develop and maintain builders' hardware standards. BHMA maintains more than 40 ANSI BHMA A156 series of standards. I was reviewing a proposed standard just the other day that will potentially be ANSI A156.44. BHMA also sponsors the ANSI BHMA certification program. Participants in this program voluntarily submit a hardware product for independent laboratory testing to confirm that the product fully meets the criteria of the ANSI BHMA standard. Self-certification may be good, but third-party certification is recognized as the best assurance of a product's compliance. The BHMA certification mark is proof of a product's quality, reliability, and uniformity, and it would be similar to the CE UKCA mark.
Okay, just then in reference to British and European standards bodies. So BSI, as some of you may have heard earlier on today, this was the world's first national standards body, and it was formed in 1901 by Sir John Wolfe Barry, and that's the man who designed London's Tower Bridge. Now, the original BSI committee met for the first time actually on the day that Queen Victoria died, so 22nd of January 1901. Since this day, it has grown from strength to strength with a catalogue of 40,000 standards. And we in GAI are privileged to be involved in a number of their standards committees and their standards drafting panels. If we move on to CEN, CEN stands for Comité Européen de Normalisation, which is French for the European Committee for Standardization. That's an association that will bring together the national standardization bodies of 34 European countries. Now, there are 3 European standardization organizations that exist. CEN is one of them, along with CENELEC and ETSI. They've all been officially recognized by the European Union and by EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, as being responsible for defining standards at European level. And again, at GAI, we are involved in CEN, where I sit on 3 of their committees for standards. We're going to move on now specifically to take a look at product standards.
So when we talk about ANSI BHMA standards, ANSI BHMA standards define different product grades for a particular hardware item. These product grades, grade 1, 2, or 3, with grade 1 being the highest, are defined by progressive levels of performance benchmarks in each applicable standard. These standards establish requirements for things like cycle tests, strength tests, operational tests, material evaluation tests, finish tests, and dimensional criteria for the products in each standard. These are some examples of cycle testing by grade. Cycle tests help give assurance of reliability of a product and help a specifier or a detailer determine which product is most appropriate for a project. While the performance requirements of a standard are not easily met with all products, they are generally considered a minimum standard. Not all grade 1 products are like comparing apples to apples. So many manufacturers test well beyond the standard and often advertise in that manner, stating things like tested to 5 times the ANSI BHMA standard. So let's look a little bit at the standards themselves. The ANSI BHMA A156.1 standard establishes specific testing requirements for butts and hinges, including cycle, lateral, and vertical wear, friction, strength, finish, and material and dimensional requirements. ANSI BHMA A156.7 establishes nationally recognized dimensions for builders' template hinges, so we can be assured that when you remove a standard 4.5 by 4.5 inch hinge from an opening, that a new hinge will fit in that same door and frame preparation. ANSI BHMA A156.17 for self-closing hinges and pivots covers both single and double acting hinges and gravity or gate pivots. Unlike A156.1, the standard has a closing force test. Another common standard for hinges would be ANSI BHMA A156.26 for continuous hinges. In general, any hinge intended for use on a fire door is required to undergo a fire test to receive a UL listing. In fact, any product installed on a fire door should be labeled or listed for that use. Two common standards for locking devices are ANSI BHMA A156.2 for board and pre-assembled locks. I think we use cylindrical locks in the US more than you might in the UK. They are fairly common on education, K through 12, even healthcare. ANSI A156.13 is the standard for mortise locks. Most manufacturers will list the ANSI BHMA function code in their product catalog, like you see on the screen, to help users identify or even convert products. Many government projects or projects that are written using the reference standard specification method will be written solely in ANSI BHMA standard nomenclature so that competitive bidding is assured. This is a little snippet from a VA specification hardware set. One more. One big difference that is visually noticeable with US mortise locks versus mortise locks on your side of the pond, Douglas, is that our cylinder or keyway sits above the lever where yours sits below.
Okay, thank you for that. And if we take a look at our equivalents, and many of our audience will be very familiar with these standards, the standard that we have for single axis hinges is EN 1935-2002, and that's requirements for single axis, so not multi-axis hinges, of lift-off or fixed pin type for windows and doors that are opening only in one direction. And that in itself is what we call a harmonized standard, or in the UK now called a designated standard. And that means that this product, when sold for a fire door or fire or escape door, must be CE marked, or for the UK going forward, will need to be UKCA marked. If we take a look at the equivalent, EN 12209-2016, I have two dates there and I'll explain why, for mechanically operated locks and latches. So that is the specifies requirements and test methods for durability, strength, security, and function of mechanically operated locks and latches. Why do I have two dates there? Well, that's because the harmonised version of the standard, that's the one that's listed in the official journal of the European Union, is the 2003 version, and it must be tested to this version in order to be CE marked. That will also apply to the UK CA mark. There is a 2016 version as well. However, that is a voluntary standard. You do not have to do that, and you cannot CE mark to that.
Okay, so ANSI BHMA A156.4 door controls contains testing requirements for door closers that are surface mounted, concealed in the door, concealed overhead, or in the floor. I think you call these floor springs. It also covers pivots. It also covers pivots for floor closers. ANSI BHMA A156.15 covers release devices. This includes closers with holders and even floor or wall-mounted electromagnets. This standard includes a creep test to assure electrically held open doors don't begin to creep shut over time. I already mentioned, next bullet, there we go. I already mentioned ANSI BHMA A156.17 when we talked about hinges. Self-closing hinges and pivots hang the door, but they're also closing devices. A minimum of 2 spring hinges are required on a fire door by code. Like all other hardware, door closers on fire door assemblies must be listed or labeled by a recognized independent testing lab. They should be tested to UL10C positive pressure. And additionally, UL 228 testing performed on door closers holders with an integral smoke detector, with or without an integral smoke detector.
If we move on to our equivalent, then we have BSEN 1154 1997, so which is a rather old standard, but at the moment is not one that is currently being updated. This is the standard that covers all controlled, surface-mounted, concealed, or transit-mounted closers, as well as both single and double-action floor springs, as we call them. We also have the standard BSEN 1155 1997, and that's for electrically powered hold-open devices. And that incorporates requirements for separate hold-open devices, as well as for hold-open mechanisms which are incorporated in a door closer. So that can include electrically powered hold-open devices for swing doors, and that is for doors manufactured according to the standard that can hold a swing door at a fixed position or can allow the door to swing freely. So either hold open or swing free. And again, both those standards are harmonized standards for Europe, designated standards for the UK, therefore must be CE marked when using a fire door or escape door, and also must be UK CA marked from the start of next year as it sits.
Exit devices. So exit devices are driven by use group or occupancy type in IBC, our International Building Code, NFPA 101, and NFPA 70, which is the National Electrical Code. Exit devices are required by IBC for educational and assembly occupancies with 50 or more persons, and high hazard. NFPA 101 adds daycare occupancies to that list, but changes the capacity to 100 or more. The NEC requires rooms with equipment of a specific amperage or voltage or battery rooms to have panic devices. The ANSI BHMA A156.3 standard establishes the requirements for exit devices. Testing in the standard helps gauge the ability to withstand repeated use and applied force. Exit devices are also tested to UL 305, which is the UL standard for safety panic hardware. When used on a fire door, exit devices are also tested to UL10C or NFPA 252. Exit devices is a generic term for this type of device. Generally, they're referred to as panic hardware on non-rated doors and must be fire exit hardware on fire door assemblies.
Okay, and our equivalent in the UK and Europe, EN 1125, panic exit devices. And we have EN 179 for emergency exit devices. So 1125 is where a panic situation may apply, and that's with a horizontal push bar or horizontal touch bar, specifically designed for use in a panic situation. Whereas emergency exit takes a look at where there is a lever handle or a push pad, or somewhere where there is trained traffic. So that is our equivalent. Just in terms of BSEN standards for hardware, and I did mention this earlier. So CE marking, or UKCA or UKNI marking, depending on where the jurisdiction, is either mandatory in EU, GB and NI for products which fall under the scope of either a European harmonised or a UK designated standard. The following products, many of which I've mentioned, must all have the appropriate conformity marking for that appropriate territory. So I've talked about some of them, but other ones that I've left out include door coordinating devices, electromechanical locks, and for further information on that, on UKCA marking, you can go to the GAI website, to the technical section, and you can download the specifiers guide to UKCA marking.
Some common NFPA standards include NFPA 80, NFPA 105, and NFPA 252. NFPA 80 regulates the installation and maintenance of assemblies and devices used to protect openings in walls, floors, and ceilings against the spread of fire and smoke within, into, or out of buildings. NFPA 105 prescribes minimum requirements for smoke door assemblies for use in providing safety to life and protection of property from smoke. NFPA 252 outlines the methods of fire testing door assemblies that testing labs and manufacturers can use to determine the degree of fire protection provided by such assemblies and assess their suitability when fire resistance of a specific duration is required. NFPA 252 is a flexible test that can be used for positive pressure testing, similar to UL10C, or a test that was previously common for swinging fire doors, UL10B. NFPA 101 requires compliance with NFPA 80 and NFPA 105, and NFPA 252 is referenced in NFPA 80 and NFPA 105. Both NFPA 80 and 101 are incorporated in part or in whole into a model building code such as IBC, which is adopted in whole or part by state or local building codes and authorities. Okay, so the hierarchy. Once a code is implemented by the authority having jurisdiction, reference standards become a legally enforceable part of the code. NFPA and ICC codes reference various organization standards within their requirements. The 2018 version of IBC has more than 400 documents referenced, and NFPA 101 references 144 documents. So in the case of the hierarchy, the ICC code would mandate when to do something, like during initial installation. NFPA 80 would tell us how, and UL10B would give us the exact testing method and compliance requirements.
Okay, so we're going to talk now just very briefly on something that Laura mentioned earlier, BS 9999 and BS 9991. So BS 9999 gives recommendation and guidance on design, management and use of buildings to achieve reasonable standards of fire safety for all people in and around them, and guidance on the ongoing management of fire safety. That is important in terms of for us, because that takes a look at compartmentation, including fire doors, as well as escape strategy. There is an equivalent standard at the moment, BS 9991, which gives recommendations, except that is in relation to residential buildings. Now, this standard is currently being revised because it's into its 5-year cycle now, and that's a panel that I currently sit on to give information and thoughts on the on hardware and on escape, and taking a look at things from the GAI perspective. So we're going to move now on to fire testing and the differentials between America and Britain and Europe.
So U.S. fire-rated doors are tested in accordance with either UL10B, 10C, or NFPA 252, but the IBC requires swinging doors to be tested to UL10C or NFPA 252 with the positive pressure testing. There are hose stream portions for the UL10C and NFPA 252 tests, and fire-rated doors must be positively latched. This is a little bit different than you do in the UK and Ireland, where you may have back-to-back pulls or push-pull plate combinations. We also use more automatic flush bolts in the US on double doors in rooms that are what we would call normally occupied. Manual bolts are still allowed in rooms that are not normally occupied or in code were allowed by the AHJ. We also tend to use more fire exit hardware on corridor doors because of the latching requirement. So UL10C we've talked about a little bit already. That's the positive pressure fire test of door assemblies. It was introduced back in 1997. It's a method of fire testing that was thought to be more accurate in simulating the conditions of a real fire. It established the neutral pressure level at a maximum of 40 inches above the sill after 5 minutes. I can remember when this happened. A lot of people were really up in arms on having to retest all of their products. I can remember some things that needed to be changed. Some door closer manufacturers changed out fluid or minimized the size of pressure relief valves. In most cases, it didn't really cause too much problems with the retesting. Metal performed pretty well. Metal seemed to swell generally during a fire, and gapping issues didn't occur. But with wood doors, we seem to have more gapping. Wood shrinks when exposed to heat, and we were suddenly required to introduce intumescent into openings. A big distinction for us is we have category A doors versus category B doors. Category A wood doors would mean that intumescent is concealed but behind the veneer edge of the door, so you don't visually see it, it's still there. Category B, it's actually applied to the framing, so you would visually see the intumescent applied to the opening.
Okay, so if we take a look at some of the key differences, so as Laura has mentioned, the US uses UL10C, NFPA 252. In Europe, European standard, EN 1634 Part 1 and EN 1634 Part 2. Also used in the UK, but UK also has the BS 47622 fire test standard, which can also be used in the Republic of Ireland. So question is, does that not mean that they're just all the same? And of course, the answer to that is a rather large no. So just to give some examples, BS 47622 is tested with less pressure than EN 1634 Part 1. And EN 1634.1 is seen to be a more stringent fire test than BS 476 Part 22 would be. Also, as previously mentioned, UL10C is tested on a latch door with a hose stream test at the end, and that measures the integrity of the tested door after exposure to fire, except for 20-minute fire doors. Okay, we're going to move swiftly on to accessibility and the differentials between America and the UK in particular.
So the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, became law in 1990. This would be the equivalent to the Equality Act in England, Wales, and Scotland, and the Disability Discrimination Act in Northern Ireland. The ADA is a federal law under the U.S. Department of Justice, which has accessibility as a requirement. So because it is a law, we can't adopt it into a building code, so we use standards to do that instead. So two commonly used accessibility standards in the U.S. for new or existing buildings is ICC A117.1, Accessible and Usable Buildings and Facilities, or ADA Standard for Accessible Design. U.S. ADA specifically mentions hardware in their publications, which is unlike what you guys do in the UK.
Okay, and with reference to what we guys do in the UK, we have the Equality Act and we also have BS 8300. Those are the standards and the laws that we know and love. So the Equality Act came into force in Great Britain on the 1st of October 2010. And what that did was that was all civil rights legislation which covered discrimination of various kinds. So that included what was known as the DDA, the Disability Discrimination Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, and Race Discrimination Act. They were all amalgamated into the Equality Act. Northern Ireland is the only one not covered by the Equality Act, but is still covered under the DDA. Now, if we take a look at BS 8300, that was a 2009 standard. It was updated in 2018 and was then split into two volumes, the External Environment Code of Practice and Buildings Code of Practice. They are wide-ranging standards which relate to many aspects of construction, but they do make specific mention of various types of ironmongery and signage and its application within those standards themselves. BS 8300 Part 2 is the one that we would use most of all in the ironmongery industry because that has a lot of information.
So when we talk about accessibility, clear opening width is a big component of that. So in the US, single doors, we have to have a clear opening width of not less than 32 inches or 815 millimeters. And we measure that from the face of the door at 90 degrees to the stop of the strike jamb. On pairs of doors, we have to have at least one leaf, providing 32 inches of clear width, unless you require both doors for your egress capacity. And in that case, it's measured from the face of the active leaf at 90 degrees to the edge of the inactive leaf in the closed position or to the mullion. Also, for sliding or bifold doors, we still are required to maintain that 32-inch minimum clear width.
Okay, if we move across to the UK then, and the clear opening width within the UK. So it states in BS 8300 Part 2 that all doors are required to have a minimum clear opening width of 800 millimeter, which is the same as 32 inch across in the States. But it does give 1000 millimeters if it's external and to be used by the public. For doors and dwellings, this is reduced to 775 millimeter in some instances. And the measurement is from the frame stop on the door closing side to the first physical feature on the hinge side. So that may well be a handle, something which is protruding. That is where the clear opening width is taken from, not from the face of the door.
Okay, when we talk about operation of hardware, what our code in the US says that all operable parts of accessible doors have to have a shape that's easy to grasp with one hand and doesn't require any tight pinching, grasping, or twisting of the wrist. So generally we say that if you can operate it with no digits, with your fist closed or with your elbow, that it would meet that accessibility requirement. Non-fixed portions of locks or other operable parts like a key or an access card is not required to comply with that standard. All of our operable hardware has to be within between 34 and 48 inches above the floor. And in some jurisdictions, they actually lower those dimensions.
Okay, if we take a look at the UK, the fixing height for lever furniture in BS 8300 Part 2 is 800 to 1050 millimeter, with 900 millimeter being the preferred position. Again, it says it should be possible to operate all door opening furniture one-handed, so without the need to grasp or twist. And it also says that care should be taken in the selection of security and fire exit fittings, such as short lever turn buttons, bolts, latches or locks, with the aim of making them manageable for all users. So you will get an indication that a lot of the intent is the same. Some of the dimensions may be different, but a lot of the intent when taking a look at this accessibility and the operation of handles or other aspects are very similar.
Okay, operation when it comes to closing. So we have a closing speed requirement and an opening force requirement. What it says about closing speed or swing speed is that door closers shall be adjusted so that from an opening position of 90 degrees, the time required to move the door to the open position of 12 degrees must not be faster than 5 seconds. That changes a little bit for spring hinges. Adjustability on spring hinges are a little bit different. And what it says for opening force is 5 pounds maximum opening force. That does exclude exterior and fire doors, although there are some states in the US that do call out an exterior opening force.
If we take a look at operation and closing in the UK, BS 8300 Part 2 states that for most disabled people to have independent access through swing or double swing doors, the opening forces when measured at the leading edge of the door should be as follows. Not more than 30 newtons from 0 degrees, i.e. that's the door in the closed position, to the 30 degrees open. And then beyond that, not more than 22.5 newtons from 30 to 60 degrees open. We are rapidly running towards the end of our presentation, which is good because that means we have plenty of time for questions. So we have some sources of further information here. So the GAI website, for example, has lots of information on all these different areas. So I mentioned the GAI specifiers guides earlier in relation to UKCA. That is one of, I believe, 9 publications that we have. And within that, we have relation to accessibility, environment, and various different standards, particularly relating to fire and escape doors. So have a look on that. GAI Guide to Standards go into more specific details on the particular standards, and we have, I believe it's 20 of those on the website, as well as a number of technical briefings which are published on a continuing basis. We have our Architectural Ironmongery Journal, our AIJ, which goes out once a quarter. Again, always keep an eye out for that because you'll normally see, you'll always see a technical article kicking around in there. And the DHI website will also have further information. In relation to American standards, if you go to the BHMA website, which is buildershardware.com, they have what are called hardware highlights. And the hardware highlights will give details in terms of a snapshot of the main points of the standard itself. And that's maybe a bit like what we would have in the GAI, where we have our guides to standards. It's not the whole standard, but it's a snapshot, although our guides to standards make specific relation to our own hardware standards in the UK. Now, we do have a comparison here as well, so thought that might just be useful. You will see the European standard as well as the ANSI and the UL standard is there. And I suppose the thing about that is it does just show that when it comes to the various different types of products, we're all covering them by standards. The standards may be different, but standards are still important. And when you take a look at the standards in particular between UK and Europe and America, you may turn around and say, well, you know, when it comes to cycle testing, the cycle testing in the States is much more considerable than the cycle testing in the European standards. We deliberately haven't put the two together because it's not a level playing field. They are tested differently. So, you know, for example, EN 1935 would have up to 200,000 cycles, and yet in America it would be substantially more than that. But they're tested differently on different test rigs in different manners. So it doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It just means that they're done differently for their own marketplaces and for their own means. So I am going to move on now to just ask if there are any questions, and I'm going to hand over. I'm just going to ask, I believe Rachel is in the background. Rachel, have you any questions you'd like to ask for either of us?
Hi both. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Douglas. Very informative again. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions. I'll go to the chat first. So there's talk of an extension by the government to allow a longer transition period for getting products tested to the new UK CA and UK NI mark. Do you know more about this? Is it something that the GAI would welcome, Douglas? I think that's for you.
Yeah, that is something that the GAI would welcome. One of the committees that I sit on is the Construction Leadership Council Brexit Forum, where we have a number of government representatives, either from MHCLG or BASE. We have discussed that at the last 2 meetings, and I have made it very clear from our perspective, from the GAI, that that is something that we would welcome. The reality is that as it sits at the moment, CE marking will not be accepted in Great Britain from the 1st of January of next year. That would cause major issues, not just in our industry, but across the whole of the construction product industry. So yes, in terms of do I think that it is something that we would welcome? Yes, we would welcome an extension. Do I think it may happen? Yes, I do. Having said that, it's controlled by government legislation, and the wheels for that can move slowly. But they're certainly aware of industry, and they're aware of our industry's position on that.
Thanks. So next question, guys, is I think this is for Laura. Under your NFPA standards, is inspection of fire doors mandatory in the US?
Yeah, according to NFPA 80, fire doors are required to be inspected. There's a difference between a a requirement and an enforced code. So it's going to depend where you are in the United States as to the enforcement of it, but it is required in NFPA 101, which we talked about earlier, which is can be a building code in and of itself. If a building code is not in place, it's required in IBC because it's a requirement in NFPA, and IBC references NFPA. It's also required in the International Fire Code. Most new construction is built to IBC or NFPA 101, and then enforced once it's built according to either NFPA 101, NFPA 1, or the International Fire Code, and all of those have requirements for inspection of fire doors.
Thanks, Laura.
Isn't it lovely? Isn't it lovely to see, by the way, that people can trot out their standards as quickly as we can?
Yeah. Do we not think that this should also be the case in the UK?
Yes, I believe that it should, and it was also a recommendation from Sir Martin Moore-Bick at the time of the Grenfell inquiry that there would be a recommendation that inspection of fire doors would be mandatory, certainly in high-risk residential buildings. Now, whether that will be taken on as part of the fire safety bill is still to be seen, but it would certainly be something that we would welcome. And in fact, the GAI, we have published an inspection which can be used by end users, and it's more in relation to closing devices than specifically on fire doors, but it is something that we'd put together and is available in the technical briefing section of the website. But yes, it would be something that would be very welcome.
Thanks, Douglas. That brings us on to sort of the next question. What would be the closing time for the fire door? Is it not defined in BSEN 1154 or equivalent standards from ANSI?
It would be. I do believe that it is in the EN 1154 for the closing time. It depends whether it's delayed action or not. So it has the amount of seconds. I'd need to check that. Don't know that off the top of my head. But yes, the opening forces are within BS 8300, but the closing time, closing speed, etc., would be something within the EN 1154 standard.
Yeah, on my end, I'm not sure that the ANSI standard specifies the closing time itself. It does. It has a not to exceed time, but the duration of it being held open is not specifically called out. So the importance is that it will close, and that's how we have the delay action being allowed on fire doors. Often people are concerned that a fire door can't have a door closer with delayed action because in many cases it can hold the door open, up to a minute. The point is that the door would need to be closed during a fire, so it should be closed within a reasonable time.
Okay.
Thank you. The next question, I think last one really, guys, is can I use American hardware that is UL marked but not CE marked in UK or Europe?
No, unless it has it could be UL marked, but it must also be CE marked for use in Europe. So there could be the possibility that if it has been tested to both standards, CE marking was there in order to, not as a safety mark, but in order to place products on the market in Europe. So if you have a product under the scope of a harmonized standard, which is now being called a designated standard in the UK, in GB, then it must have that it must have the CE marking on it in order to be placed on the market. It doesn't matter if it has UL or whatever else it has. If it's under a harmonized standard, and I've given a list of those earlier, then it must have that product marking. And as I say, at present, as it sits, going into next year, start of next year, it would then have to be UKCA marked for GB. So I believe we could probably be at the end.
Yeah, there are a few other questions, and again, I think we have to take them offline.
Yeah,
it's an interesting subject.
It is, and I'm glad you've said that. It's certainly something that I find of interest. It's really good to see what happens on the other side of the pond. And certainly
Yeah.
there are people as passionate about hardware and hardware standards as we are. So we're now racing towards the end in terms of the end of the session. What I would like to do is like to thank UL for sponsoring this session, which is very, very much appreciated. And I would really, really like to say a huge big thank you to Laura, not just for presenting, but for the content within the slides and for all the information and all the rehearsing and the time that we've spent back and forth. Contrary to what you may think, these things don't just happen by accident. And there is a lot of work that goes in behind the scenes. So Laura, thank you so much, and I look forward to returning the compliment to be able to assist from our members' perspective for your audience. So thank you very much, Laura. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I think at this stage what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Simon for the close. If you haven't signed up for our virtual race evening, you're missing out. Please do feel free. But I'm going to hand over now to Simon. I'm going to sign off, although I'll be at the virtual race night, so you'll see me there, as opposed to lying down in a darkened room, which I feel like doing after 2 webinars in one day. But thank you all very much for your attention. Certainly enjoyed presenting to you today. Loved having Laura as well as my co-presenter, and look forward to seeing you again. Bye for now.
Thanks, guys.
That's it for the formal programme. We hope you've enjoyed the day. I'd like to thank our speakers for their excellent content, our sponsors who made the event possible, of course the GAI staff team, and also the team at Be Sure Event Management for keeping things on track. Finally, of course, our thanks to you, our members and guests, for taking an active part in the day. We'd like to ask you to complete a short feedback survey, which will be sent to you soon, just to let us know how we got on. For those of you staying on for the race night, click the link that's been sent to you, and I'll see you at the course in a minute via Zoom. If you're not attending race night, you're welcome to continue to use this platform to network. Thank you again for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you at one of the Guild's virtual or in-person events soon. Stay safe.